I've been working with a number of the folks in this room on the Democracy Thematic Year and the Democracy Initiative in the College of Liberal Arts. So we have lots of really exciting programming coming your way this year. In the next few weeks, we have an event on Civics and Voting 101. We're actually hosting a city council and mayoral forum that's going to be student moderated. And so we're going to be really hyper-focused on the local level for that event. And on and on and on. There are many, many more events than just that. If you're interested in finding out where those events are, there is a Democracy Thematic Year website, and on that website, there is a calendar of events, and it is very populated right now. Please feel free to check it out and join us again. I want to turn it over to my colleague, Peter, in the Political Science Department. We're going to be hearing from him as the moderator today. He is an expert in international relations, foreign policy, all sorts of stuff like that, so a great person to sort of help set the stage and take it away.
Thanks, Sam. So I'll do this from a sedentary position, so lazy, but I want to take a first few seconds just to thank Sam Hoetling, Elise Dietrich, and Beth Eder for organizing and publicizing the event. Thank you to the panelists for agreeing to join us and donate your time. I'll introduce everybody in a moment. And thank you all, the audience, for coming along. I'll try and be very brief. So as you may know, I think tomorrow is officially the UN's designated International Day of Democracy. And the purpose of that day, as proposed by the United Nations, is to celebrate, strengthen, and uphold democratic principles the world over, and to celebrate the existence of democratic political systems. So I'm going to begin, after I've introduced the panel, I'll ask them a simple question. A simple question that I hope will provoke a complex discussion. The question is, what is something that could be done by individuals, by civil society, by governments or the international community to strengthen democracy today? And we'll use that question as an entry point to some of the larger puzzles around democracy. Drawing on their diverse training and perspectives, as well as their personal experiences as global citizens, we hope the panel will provide not just some answers to the question of how to uphold democracy, but pose some thoughtful questions for all of us too. So let me briefly introduce our panel. I'll go in order. So to my left, we have Antonio Pedros Gaston, Associate Professor of Spanish. Antonio is an expert on Spanish literature, transatlantic literature, feminism, and queer studies, and all of his research, I think it's fair to say, touches on themes of power and injustice and democracy, a lot of the topics that we'll discuss today. So a lot of the doing of democracy from the perspective of a humanities scholar. Dr. Marcela Velasco, Associate Professor in Political Science, and her expertise is in the areas of comparative government, Latin America, environmental politics. Her research mostly focuses on ethnic politics, ethnic social movements, local governance, territorial politics, environmental justice. I think some of her research, cutting edge research on collective trauma and indigenous politics, especially in Latin America, might be of special interest to us today. We have Kure Mao, Associate Professor of Sociology here at CSU. Dr. Mao is a green criminologist specializing in environmental governance and natural resource management in an illiberal context. So many of you will be familiar with environmental politics and governance in liberal democracies, but how does that look in an illiberal context? Dr. Mao's work focuses on the institutional factors that have perpetuated environmental harm throughout China's most vulnerable populations, as well as the state and public responses to green victimization in China and East Asia more generally. We have Julia Munsaka, a PhD student in the Department of Political Science. Julia received a BA from the University of Zambia, a master's degree in Germany, and then a master's degree from Seton Hall University in the United States. Her research interests in politics of natural disasters and climate change impacts in Southern Africa. And finally, we have Dr. Daniel Weitzel, an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and senior research fellow in the Department of Government in the University of Vienna, where he was also a postdoctoral researcher between 2020 and 2022. Daniel's research focused on comparative politics, a regional focus on Europe, and a methodological interest in the definition, conceptualization, and measurement of democracy. So we've got a great all-star lineup of panelists. I'll conclude that, and I will ask our panelists to try and be brief, which is very difficult for us as scholars and egomaniacs. But I'll ask them to be trying very brief and keep an opening gambit to just 3 minutes if possible, because we want to leave time for the audience to weigh in with their thoughts and questions too. But I'll pose that question again. What is something that could be done by individuals, civil society, governments, or the international community to strengthen democracy today? Maybe if we start with Antonio on my left, and we'll go down the road.
If anyone wants to start, I'm happy to just allow you. Thank you, everybody, for letting me see more or less the time of enter. So I think that one of the big things when we are thinking about democracy is different theories. But I mean, what is democracy? Is the government of the majority, or is the government with respect to minorities? And I think that that's the most cutting edge point of discussion, especially nowadays with all the race of very autocratic understandings of nationhood, etc. I'm thinking specifically in Europe, where we are having a very, but not only in Europe, where we have a very alt-right kind of propositions or understandings, very illiberal democratic understandings. And I think that what can we do? I mean, we have to be visible, we have to be engaged, we have to stop being complacent. I mean, I'm thinking specifically, for example, in the case of the US, the situation about the access of women to abortion, etc., that everybody gave for granted, and that allows for the situations that later on we have ended up with, and which there has been a very, I mean, of course, I'm not talking about everybody, but I'm saying that there was some sort of complacency on many people, both men and women, who were not really, were assuming that, well, that's for granted. And I think that that's one of the things that we have to be very careful. We have to be very strategic. We have to be very work on collaborations. I mean, I'm thinking specifically of these couple of months before we had an election in Spain. It was very interesting because the right presented a very autocratic understanding of the nation, and the reality is that though they won the majority vote, but they didn't reach an absolute majority. And we are going to end up with a constitutional government that is really the sum of a lot of very minority-oriented understandings of the nation, in which both left and right are coming together. They would rather have that kind of understanding than the other one. So I believe that that can be an example of the coalition building that eventually we'll have to meet. We have to choose, what is it that we are going for? We are going for a very autocratic understanding of the nation, or we want to have a more inclusive. And if we have a more inclusive, then we have to be willing to reach negotiations and to help advance, but always thinking on the nation as an addition of an incredible array of differences and diversity, and not just very monolithic understandings.
Thank you. It was under 3 minutes, so it's really remarkable. I'm going to want to come back to this theme of complacency, hopefully in the Q&A. So I want to make a note of that. But please, Marcela.
Hi, and thank you for inviting me to this. So what I want to focus on is something that worries me a lot, and it's that democracy has become a catch-all term to mean just about anything. And to justify all sorts of things, occupations, invasions, illegal politics. So it's very important then to differentiate democracy from the state. So democracy as a political institutions, as a set of political institutions associated with civil and political rights, so very minimal understanding. So things like elections and voting and all that is necessary to have clean elections, competitive elections, fair, free, frequent elections that people accept. Furthermore, freedom of the press and freedom of intellectual freedom, freedom of association, all of these minimal requirements to have a free society and which are, clearly associated with democracy and democratization, we need to differentiate that from the state, from the political institutions that we associate with the government, and the capacities that a government needs to have in order to deliver what people need, like security, economic development, well-being, attention during national disasters. So it's very important, first and foremost, to think about those differences when we're thinking about what's going on with, politics in general. And so the question is, what can be done? Well, to understand this, to discuss this, to study this, to be aware of this as an individual, and to kind of have talks about these issues with other people who may not be as politically inclined. Because it's really important to both defend our democracy and defend our institutions, to defend our government. And one of the things that defend our government at the same time that we challenge it. So one of the things that worries me that I see in this country is that we are eroding institutions, major institutions that sustain democracy. So I study Latin America, and I study very local politics, municipal politics, indigenous politics. And at that level, that is often very clear, especially with indigenous people, that they have been in a process of 30, 40 years of trying to build up their own capacities to deliver the goods and services their own people need, because the larger government has failed to do this, or is not interested in doing this. So building up capacities to adjudicate conflict, to make decisions, to address all sorts of needs that their communities have, education, health, communications. And democracy is often doesn't necessarily result from that. But under the right circumstances, it can thrive if the institutions that are being developed are subjected to voting and subjected to assemblies and different levels of negotiation between the people in the communities and the people and the government institutions. So for me, what needs to be done and understood is that we need to protect the collective, the things that represent the collectivity, and defend the collectivity, and are really in the position of delivering these really important public goods. And at the same time, we need to be, challenging who is acting on behalf of the collectivity. And normally, in the current crisis, they may not be doing that. They may be acting on behalf of minority groups or special groups. So I think that's my bit. I don't know if I'm.
That's great. That's perfect. Thanks, but yeah, I will definitely, some of the questions we want to come back to this distinction between the people, the collectivities, you put it, and the institutions that are erected to govern them. Thank you for putting that on the table, Chris.
Hi. So first of all, I would like to thank the College of Liberal Arts for providing this wonderful opportunity for me to learn from fellow panelists as well as the audience, and also for sharing my perspectives. So I spent my formative years really growing up in Taiwan during the late 1980s and the 1990s. It was a pivotal period, during which Taiwan actually transitioned from a strict authoritarian country to a relatively softer authoritarian country, and then to a robust democracy. So this unique experiences, this unique historical development and trajectory really shaped my desire, motivated me to become a social scientist. And because of my academic pursuits, later on I had the opportunity to actually live in a few illiberal societies and to conduct research there. So to me, these experiences really further nuance my understanding of what is exactly democracy, what is exactly collective, what is exactly development, and also how the global political dynamics profoundly shape these definitions. So, I understand that I only have 1.5 minutes, and we're answering really important questions. So I just go straight to my answer. So that was a big question, right? What can we do? So I would like to argue that, from my personal lens, I truly believe that we, especially those of us in the professions of knowledge generation, we have a responsibility to use our expertise to counter disinformation. We have a responsibility to do that actively. Specifically, we need to kind of expose the interplay between power and discourse, and also leveraging our position to champion the results of meticulous fact checking. To me, these are really the most important steps to build a well-informed citizenship. In addition to that, I think we also need to support autonomous civil society, not just in the United States, but also globally. The presence of grassroots advocacy and oversight groups really undergirds the effective governance, and also it creates and fosters a plurality of viewpoints, which I think is really important to democracy. So I think it is essential that such grassroots organizations actually receive the funding, the training, as well as the opportunity to learn different methodologies to engage and investigate the empirical reality. And I think that we actually can support those of us who are generating knowledge. We can actually support, not lead, but support that effort. And I'm really glad that all of those things are part of Engaged Scholarship here in the College of Liberal Arts.
Thank you, Glenn. Heartening to hear there's a role for us. So at least we can do something. Julia, please.
So for me, an important concern that I have an important concern that I have is the issue of disinformation as well. So for me, it's how can we address disinformation, because I think that disinformation is becoming a huge factor in shaping election processes, voting outcomes, and really I see disinformation as a threat to dependable information pathways, which democracy itself relies on. It's becoming a key driver of decreased confidence in political processes because it disrupts democratic processes, and it also feeds skepticism and builds mistrust in democracy itself and the system. So I think to address this, we need to ensure that reliable information is readily available and accessible for everyone. We need support for media literacy and public education. We need codes of practice, which will aim to spread disinformation in various ways, such as fact checking, transparency, fighting and limiting bots, disabling the creation of fake news, fake websites and the like, and also just empowering consumers by improving their access to diverse and trustworthy content.
Thank you.
So I think I'm going to throw in a wrench here into all of this, because underlying the statement so far was this idea that that's something like democracy is something that's inherently desirable or desired by people. And I think that if we really want to protect democracy as the institution that it is, as the norms and the processes that it is, we need to come to terms with the fact that democracy is not necessarily a good that is inherently valued by the people. That is not something that people have a strong preference about or are not willing to sacrifice for something. If we really want to protect democracy, I think we need to get clear with the fact that people are not Democrats with this profound, unwavering belief in democracy, and they don't value it for itself. And that we at any time in history, in any location, have had this possibility that people will just sell out democratic beliefs or democratic institutes or democratic processes for something else, be it economic stability, be it just a frustration about policy, be it homophobia, be it religion. There are trade-offs that people make with this. And as a German, I can speak to the history of my country here, because we've had two democracies. We now have, since 1945, to an enormous extent, thanks to the United States, I have to say, an incredibly stable democracy with a really robust constitution. But in the interwar period, between the First World War and the Second World War, we had our first democratic experiment, the Weimar Republic. And the Weimar Republic had a wonderful constitution. It was incredibly progressive for that time. And all of you know what happened. The problem with the constitution or the Weimar more generally was that it was not what in political science called a defensive democracy. Like a democracy that had like a shield and a sword to defend itself from enemies within and enemies from the outside. And I think that is important for a democracy to like really recognize that your norms, your mechanisms, your procedures, your institutions, all of those can be co-opted, taken over by people that want to erode your democracy, that do not believe in this. And that there is at any time in history a ready pool of people that are okay with that. Maybe not necessarily that they are inherent anti-democrats. I'm not necessarily saying this one, but we have a latent pool of people that are willing to make this fail. And if we lie to ourselves and assume that people don't have that that's not in the population, then we run into the problem of surprises. And then people now might think like, oh, the political right when it comes to this. This is not an ideological aspect. That is like a human aspect. Yeah. So to answer the question is like, we need institutional rules and norms in a democracy in a way that they are generating a defensible democracy. That democracy that can protect itself against the inside, enemies from the inside and from the outside that want to overthrow democratic institutions. But we also need to have democracies work in specific ways that make people recognize that it is people don't just like voting for democracy. That's not a process that they are excited about. Voting turnout sort of tells us that already. But democracy produces goods, be it protection of minority rights, be it like economic growth, be it decreases in mortality rates of babies. And that needs to work in democracy. And we sort of need to kind of this one. And that is hard, I think.
So thank you, Daniel, and thanks to all the panelists. I have a few questions that I'll ask as moderator to kind of tie together some of the themes, but then pretty quickly, I'd like to turn it over to the audience for questions. So if you have any, please do write them down and I'll be sure to come to you. But I want to pick up on Daniel's comments and tie them back to what we started with Antonio about the theme of complacency. Because it does invoke the idea, or it seems to imply to me, that there's a constant and latent threat to democracy at all times. It's not static, it's not neutral or natural, it takes work to sustain. It implies there's a threat, right? There's someone or something trying to tear democracy and democracies down. So I guess my question for the panelists is, what and Daniel addressed some of this, but what is that threat? Is it us? We all kind of anti-democrats at heart and we need to be tamed to become Democrats? Is it political parties for strategic kind of self-interested reasons to tear down democracy? These are bad people, they're just bad actors in the world threatening democracy. What is the generic nature of this threat? Or maybe even feel free to suggest some specific actors who today threaten democracy. So maybe we'll just lay the table with some thoughts on what is the threat to democracy as you see it. And maybe we'll
I would say personally, I think that we have a contrast. On the one side, when we talk about democracy, I work on literature, so for me words are very important. The demos is the people. So number one, the question is who is the people when we talk about the people? And of course there we have a constant tension in between people who think that people is basically that old construction that is like a master enslaving us, or more like an aspiration towards a more perfect human. Those are completely different kind of master narratives. So I think that that's, for example, a very, very important thing. Also, I think that we have to understand democracy is really one of the presents, maybe venomous present from the Enlightenment to the world. And we have on the one side a very enlightened understanding of life, of existence, of society, etc. But it's being challenged like crazy from a very neoliberal understanding of the individual, not of society. So we have a constant tension between that struggle in between society as more than the unity, and the idea that no, unity is much more important, or the individual should be above. And hello, I mean, we are in a libertarian haven that is the West. So I mean, this should sound familiar as that kind of very clear tension existed. So.
So your question made me think of, again, of Latin American politics and the Latin American left in the 50s and 60s, that they were very suspicious of democracy and associated it with bourgeois democracy, like this sort of Marxist analysis of democracy as a institution designed to protect the wealthy and their interests. So no respect for democracy or no support for democracy. And then the military dictatorships come. And so Congresses are disbanded, Constitution is put on hold, all of these guarantees that somehow existed to participate in the public sphere are gone. Many people landed in jail, were killed, disappeared, or exiled. So with the process of democratization that begins variously depending on the country, late 80s, early 1990s, the left learned that lesson that you can't take it for granted, you can't be complacent, and you have to at least have a minimum of democratic rights in order to survive politics, the political game. I don't think the right has learned the lesson, at least in Latin America, because they accepted the democratic transition partly as a result of international pressures and also partly as a result of the fact that the military was horribly mismanaging the economy, and people wanted civilians back in place, and they wanted some way to hold the government accountable for the decisions it had made vis-a-vis the economy and other things. So that's my point there, that I don't know if it's about complacency, but it's about like taking this stuff seriously. And that's a lesson there.
Yeah, thank you. But Julie, do you want to go? You seem like you have two things. The big threats to democracy.
Yeah, I think in African context, I think that in Africa, the threat to democracy is like the leadership that we have and like political leaders, because like we've been seeing a gradual like erosion of democratic norms in terms of abuses of power, not following the rule of law, military coups, violations of human rights. For example, since 2021, there've been 7 coups, military coups on the continent, with the last one just being Gabon. On August 30th, we saw a coup in Niger, Burkina Faso, Sudan, Guinea, Chad, and Mali. And then also a lot of presidents have been abusing their power by changing constitutions, which have been eliminating the 2-term limits. For example, the presidents of Togo, Uganda, Chad, Cameroon, Egypt, and Rwanda, where Paul Kagame has been in power since 2000. There was a 2-term limit, but then there was a constitutional referendum in 2015, which allowed him to move for a 3rd term and the ability to run for a further 5-year terms. And he just announced that he's going to be running for elections next year. So he'll probably be in power until 2034 or possibly even indefinitely. So I think the political leadership plays a big threat to democracy.
Great. You want to speak to the question?
Sure, yeah. So I'd like to echo the point on complacency. I think, a lot of times complacency is really built on privilege. Specifically because if we actually look at the history of Taiwan, after 50 years of colonial rule by the Japanese, and then 60 plus more years of authoritarian rule, democracy and also presidential, the opportunity to choose your own leader was really viewed as a collective victory. As a victory that actually helped to build collective identities, the emerging national identity of the Taiwanese. Even for, so I think since 1996, the voting rate for presidential elections in Taiwan has always been higher than 85%. it's something that people treasure and care about. And even in authoritarian China, whenever the authoritarian regime actually opened like a little door or just like a little space for people to deliberate, such as public hearings about environmental impacts, you see, really citizens, they show up and they dare to express their opinions and ideas, even under tremendous threats in terms of backlashes, political backlashes. Another thing that in terms of the threats to democracy, I can go on and talk about late capitalism. I can go on and talk about environmental crises, how these things generate profound uncertainties and risk. I can do all of those. But one thing that I want to emphasize is really what I learned today, specifically in terms of the separation between state and democracy. What I really worry about is in the disguise or, in the attempt to defend democracy, states actually violate its own fundamental democratic principles. And I'll give you a case in point, and I'll be quick. So November 2018, the Department of Justice of the United States started the so-called China Initiative. It lasted until February 2022. The Department of Justice specifically stated that in unfairly target scholars, professors, and academics of Chinese descent and suspect their disloyalties and impose unfounded and manufactured accusations just because they look a certain way or their first names or last names are pronounced a certain way. For me, that is actually the biggest threat when the state, in an effort to build collective consciousness, a collective identity, actually violate the very foundation and principles where the society relies on to operate.
Thank you for raising that, Gray. And I'll come to you just one second, Daniel. But I do want to echo that point because I was reading yesterday a very enthusiastic piece online celebrating Democrats and Republicans working together in Congress on the issue of China. And it's just great. Is this a bipartisanship? In this era of hyper polarization, the two parties can get along to vilify, right? To vilify someone and people. And I read that yesterday, but this is really corrosive because we know, as some of us know as academics, there's an underside to that bipartisanship that is very ugly and is resulting in a spike in racist and bias-related incidents against the Chinese Americans, people of Chinese descent, and other Asian Americans in the United States. And this is what Marcel was talking about: the state working, functioning, hooray for democracy, but the people for whom the state exists not benefiting as a result. So, abusing my privilege as the chair there, but Daniel, please, threats to democracy.
So I think there are two types of threats, and I agree. I think Guri and Julia both made that point. One about economics. Democracy as a regime type needs to justify itself, and how that matters to most people is really questions about unemployment, about inflation, about the cost of living, and people will go to alternatives if they feel like there are no options. So the economy is both for authoritarian regimes and for democracies. That's a breakdown. If people do not feel they are taken care of a regime, they will abandon it. They will abandon authoritarian regimes. China right now is facing enormous problems. If you do not disclose a youth unemployment rate, that doesn't mean that youth unemployment goes away. People are still young and unemployed, and the legitimacy of the regime then starts to fade. And then another threat to democracy is this question of the elites and the masses. And I want to take you guys back to the Obama-McCain election. And the difference, or the question of whether or not how different the voters in that Obama-McCain election were to the voters in the Trump and Biden election, or in the Trump and Clinton election. I don't think that the average American voter changed in that way, fundamentally. people, like, what would have happened in these years that fundamentally made these people different? A key point for me, like something that I, as a German, like stood out to me in that election was when we came to the town hall in whatever state, and a lady gets up and starts saying, "Oh, but Barack Obama, he's a Muslim, you should not," and he cut her off immediately. He said, like, I, as the elite, the political elite in this country, do not allow this discourse. Like, I stop you now, and I rein in. I set the rules of the political game. And that's what elites do. Elites set the rules. They allow discourse that is happening. Whether or not you can challenge them with democratic rules, whether or not you can undermine the legitimacy of an American citizen to become a president. So, one threat to democracy is, I think, this latent reservoir of anti-democratic potential in the masses. And so that is there, but then also the elites that then can tap into this. I know this sounds problematic, that you need to have like democratic ideals need to come from like the top, and like the rules of the game needs to be set. That sounds iffy. I acknowledge that. And I do also acknowledge that like plenty of democracy projects came from the masses. But maintaining has to be in a elite discourse. Elites need to set the rules and say, you know what, there are certain things we won't say and we won't do, certain things we won't accept. And once elites give that up, you have a problem, because then you might end up in a situation where like a capable person comes into power just at the right moment, just at the right time. And then democracy is gone. And once it's gone, maintaining it, then in effect is impossible.
So a few of you have mentioned the role of elites, and Julia was talking about leaders. A few of you have talked about the importance of grassroots, and maybe we need both for democracy to survive and to thrive. I want to come back to that in a second. But one question I have, and maybe it's going to be useful for context, is there's a conventional wisdom in the United States, certainly from the Biden administration, that democracy is on the back foot, that democracy is under attack, that there's democratic backsliding taking place, home and abroad, and that this is widespread, and that we're living through an era of democratic shrinking. So I'm interested, maybe I'll begin with Daniel, because I know he studies some of the measures of democracy, and then we'll invite other voices too. Is that true? Is it empirically the case that democracy is receding? Do we know, based on your panelists' understanding of different regions of the world, does that ring true to you? Well, what is the health of democracy today?
So I have to say this is the second panel on democracy that I'm attending in as many weeks. And the other one was just about that, about democratic backsliding. Is it happening? To what extent is it happening? And how can we measure it? And there are people that argue that there is no democratic backsliding. I personally am more in the camp that we are really seeing democratic backsliding in specific places. But it is so difficult to like really pinpoint this. Like, for example, the United States, right? Is it democratically backsliding? You had an election. You had a little bit of a whoopsie-doo on like January 6th. Like the transition of that whole thing like didn't go smoothly. Whoopsie-doo is the technical term. But like your institutions preserve. And they are not like doing it fast right now, but they are getting at the people who did it. They are getting at the people who are organizing it. And you have to like go back to like Watergate. And like, I'm not so proud of American politics. Watergate was also not fast. That took forever. And maybe one of the cardinal sins was not to punish the president associated with that one, that happened at that point. But so it's difficult to say because the United States backsliding right now. There are democratic indicators, measures that point to this one. Polity 2 is one of these measures that measures democracy. That is pointing towards backsliding. My favorite measure, since I'm like partly involved with them, is from the Varieties of Democracy Project, also indicating backsliding. So probably there is backsliding, not necessarily with electoral rights. Elections still work, and elections also are working now in places where we wouldn't expect them to work, authoritarian regimes, now also do elections. but other components of its deliberative aspects of its, the minority aspects of democracy, that is sort of backsliding. So I can take a purely definitional aspect of democracy that is focused on elections. No, not at all. If we look at the civil liberties aspect in democracies, then probably yes, we might be observing that sort.
Well, thoughts, yeah, Julie, but
It's sort of difficult test for everyone. So because I see it both ways, especially in Africa. Like I talked about the police, so in one way it is backsliding, but there've also been like positive developments and encouraging movements for democracy in Africa. For example, talking about civil liberties. The president of Tanzania, Hassan, she expanded the civil spaces by reversing some of the restrictions that were imposed by her late predecessor, Magufuli. And then in Zambia, they overcame a repressive political environment to elect the opposition leader just 2 years ago. So there have been some positive developments, but at the same time, there's also been a decline in other parts of the continent.
Thank you. Well, anyone weighing on this question?
I mean, in Europe, definitely you can see the last set of elections that have been happening continentally, and the race of the alt-right to even reach in power in Italy, for example, I think is pretty exemplary of how democracies are receding. That doesn't mean that democracies are in mortal peril, but definitely they are under a huge stress and threat. And again, that we cannot take for granted the access to rights. And as our colleague was indicating, I love that when he indicated that, complacency comes from privilege. And that's as clear as well. We are coming from, there is a very clear privilege understanding of things that, if I'm not getting X, Y, or Z, I feel like everything should be broken, because obviously some people have less to lose from losing democracy than some others. And of course they can have the privilege of, they know that they are going to be better off no matter what because of status, etc. There is also a lot of misunderstanding. We come from we in the US too. We have been living through that kind of starving the beast mentality that Reagan was talking about, for example, when it comes to education, etc. If you are not investing in education, if you are not supporting education, it's very unlikely that people are going to make educated decisions down the line. It's a very logical consequence. So if we continue eroding education and taking education out of schools, because this should not be taught in schools, this is parents will have to do those kind of things. All of those have enormous consequences.
We only have an hour for our discussion. I want to make time for the audience questions. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand, and you can feel free to direct it to a specific panelist, or you can just ask a question and then I will redirect it towards a specific panelist. But would anyone in the audience like to ask a question or make a comment at this juncture? The gentleman in the background, Star Wars shirt. Yep. So the AC in this room is they put a hurricane in the roof and they use that to cool so if you could speak up, we could hear you.
Yeah, so now it's not formal there. But one thing I wanted to add is that Democratic backsliding, it's very obvious there's signs that show the world that it seems the nation was susceptible to it, especially to the Civil War and authoritarian takeover, stuff like that. Through time, not only with democracy, but with citizens, many of these countries that are now are like the regime of many of the first technology that kind of put the democracy before the end of the war. Is it possible that maybe more stability and transport of that stability? Is it possible that these
Thank you. It's a great question. So I don't know if you could hear it over the AC because we have, like I said, they got a hurricane going on there. But the question was, does the age of a democracy, does that seem to be correlated with its durability and its strength? So new democracies, post-colonial, post-liberation struggle, post-communist democracies, are they more at risk than older democracies? And would you like to direct that to anyone in particular, or should I pick? Okay. Correct. You seem take a stab at it.
So I probably cannot answer your question. I probably cannot do justice to your question. But whenever we're talking about, democracy backsliding, the nerd in me started to wonder who gets to define what actually constitutes as democracy. Specifically, in the measurements of democracies, if you look at the Freedom House report, if you look at The Economist, or even to a certain degree, the very good VDM project, a lot of the definition actually rely on expert subjective interpretations, a lot of those measurements. So this really begs the question of representation and whether or not we actually have inclusive inputs from all strata of a given society. Is democracy just a global north concept that is kind of like development, that is actually so-called development that can be uniformly implanted on other countries? Or can we actually open the definition of democracy to other post-colonial or former authoritarian countries and really look at the evolving and emerging nature of public deliberation? So, for example, I'll be really quick. I know we're in. In China, the Chinese Communist Party, I don't agree, but they claim that they have democracy too. They're the most democratic country on this planet because they propose collective democracy. However, if you look at environmental governance, that particular approach in some situations really help to resolve the issue of resource conservation as well as scarcity of resources for the greater good. Is it some type of democracy? I don't know. I'm still learning. But I really think that we need to open up the definition of democracy before we talk about, whether or not we have backsliding.
Can I pick on Marcela for the Latin American cases? Does it seem to be that the longer democracy exists, the stronger it is? Or new democracy is more vulnerable?
So what the Latin Americans are identifying is precisely this distinction. So the quality of the state institutions, the political institutions to sustain democratic institutions, that's really pivotal there. So you have a country like Mexico where it's sort of falling at the seams because the government has not been able to control the cartels and the drug trade and all of that stuff. Yet they're having, they keep having elections and they keep having, fairly competitive, legitimate elections. And the worry is, the state. And that a lot of candidates in the peripheral areas of Mexico can't run for office if they are antagonizing or contesting the cartels. So that sort of thing is really of key importance. The ability to maintain sufficient capacities to support democracy, or at least some of the basic elements of it. So in that sense, this discussion of democratic backsliding to me is a bit sterile, because I agree with you. Like, what are you talking about when you say, so this country or that country was a democracy? It's often very ideological.
Yeah. I'm sorry, what was I saying?
You were talking about that. Basically, we haven't more. I was wondering, a lot of countries don't have a very independent actually was a conflict with that. You have to give it a lot of
Thank you. Dan, do you wanna?
Yeah, so when you asked this question about like the history of democracy and like whether or not like over time all of this was like better and become more stable, what came to my mind was when I met my wife during grad school, we decided as a side activity to like not only work and like talk about work, do a dance course. And initially in that dance course, like you learn the movements of the other person, like the signals they are sending when they want to turn and all of these things. And then in the beginning, it doesn't work all that well. And like your first couple of steps, like you're still figuring out how you move yourself. And then you also have to figure out how the other person moves. And you learn over time how you move in the system and how that other person moves in the system and how that can actually like really work together and look good. Not saying that it looked good when we did it, but at least we got better over time. And similarly in democracies, when democracies emerge, when new systems come out, people need to learn their role. The norms need to be established, institutions need to be established, they need to follow them. Generally, I do not believe in the role of like individuals in politics. I like more generally think of like averages, mass public, and things like this. But when you are at these punctuated equilibriums, where like stuff rapidly changes, individuals play an enormous role in like what they are establishing as conduct. So having in the beginning of democracy someone who really emphasizes specific institutions, the process, even if like that makes them vulnerable or lose power, that is important. The most crucial point of a new democracy is the first election the second election. When the leader loses, what are they doing? If they are saying, yeah, you know what, I lost, see y'all in 4 or 5 years ago again, then that works. And that is like the dance that needs to be learned. Voters need to learn what happens, and parties need to learn the judiciary, the media, all of those need to find their role. That I think is the reason why democracies over age get better, because like they figure out their movement and like how to like manage that ballroom, which in the beginning like they might step on each other's toes, and whether or not that then escalates or not really depends on like I step on my wife's toes. Whether or not you continue dancing depends on whether or not she forgives me in that moment or it's infuriating. And that can happen in the democratic process as well.
So Antonio wants to weigh in here, and then we'll take another audience question. Yeah.
Just, again, as a person that works in literature, I wonder always when I hear post-colonial, what is the post in post-colonial? And what I mean by that is, are we just talking about a time that comes after the colony, or a real transcending of the frame of that mindset? And the reality is that, one of the oldest democracies in Occidental history was Chile, that was massacred on September 11, 1973. So, and that was, with the assistance of a democratic government that was blackmailed in that situation. So for me, that's part of when we talk about post-colonial, we have to understand, when we are talking, for example, about Africa, the enormous involvement and engagement both of Europe, Russia, China, etc., that makes those societies basically ungovernable from the principles of democracy. We are placing the interest of several countries and elites above that common good. That would be the damage. And that I think is important. Thank you.
There's a gentleman in a white shirt at the back. Oh, 1 second.
I just wanted to add quickly to Antonio's point about post-colonialism. It's just that a lot of the times you also find that the Western concepts of like democratic concepts have been borrowed without success, especially in African in the African context. So I think we need to also create an enabling environment which would enable citizens to kind of live in accordance with their beliefs as well, traditional values, without obstruction from government. So just putting that into context as well.
Yeah, context now. Thank you. Excuse me, so yeah, in the white shirt at the back.
Just an ask the question, what is the future especially when you look at the American champion democracy, And now America is struggling hard on them. Because of the situation. And now it's actually the government and against China. So people are going to be having the more cases of the in China's especially when you look at China's really over the past 3 centuries of high century now. A lot of African countries are beginning to accept the scenario of and really curious the way out because we had we cannot call it a different anymore in there for 30 years, 40 years. So what's the essence of the democracy? America is exported and then there are no core values to it. The institutions are not respected. There's no governance process around how voting, literally voting is in part. Look at Mexico, votes are leaked. This people have never been decided. So really, I'm just going into a future where democracy is losing its grip.
So we have a few minutes left, and that's a great question. I couldn't have planned it better myself, but to kind of ask the panelists maybe to answer this question on the future of democracy, right? And this titanic struggle is the way the Biden administration portrays it with autocracy and democracy. If we could ask the panelists to, in a few words to address this question of the future of democracy, maybe I could phrase it: are you pessimistic, or are you optimistic? And what makes you optimistic, if optimistic?
I mean, I think that democracy is like a person with a chronic illness that I mean, you learn to live with it. And what I mean, and literally, I mean, I know I'm sounding peculiar, but really, I mean, I think that I mean, democracies are constantly being challenged, are constantly having to reinvent, having to reassess, having to adapt. And there are big crises like health issues that sometimes keep you for a week in bed. But I think that democracy eventually, it's I cannot see really the future of humankind outside of some sort of democratic understanding. Not for the whole planet, not for that kind of thing, but it's once you've tried the food, it's very difficult to really just be told that will never happen. So I think that there is future. However, we have to understand that it's ingrained in that very political system, the trouble that we constantly find, and it comes in waves and what.
Well, from my Latin American perspective, I'm actually very optimistic for a very pragmatic or obvious reason. Is most of these countries in our region are not governable under any system, so democracy does a pretty good job. What military, what authoritarian regime is going to govern Brazil or Argentina or Chile or there's the citizenry is a lot more educated. They have the experience of the disasters of the military, and democracy has sort of delivered. And so I think for those reasons, people are pretty pragmatic. So it's good to have other people mind the shop and experiment and then vote them out and stuff like that is my view on this.
Thank you. We'll write it too, so I hate to rush you three, but
all right, I'll be really quick. I'm very optimistic. And I will argue that, through my research and also my personal history, I would like to argue that authoritarianism is really a short-term fix. You create, you see, it's a very easy way to divert all of the resources into one or two goals. However, authoritarianism has a self-intensification tendency in terms of loyalty, and that will actually eventually generate a lot of issues, especially when you have profound transformation, social transformations in development, in resource conservation. I do want to say one thing that I'm not really optimistic about. I think it's great to dance. I love dancing too, but if we're complacent, there's always going to be people who would like to shoot up the dance hall, and such as January 6th, 2021. And that's why we all need to pay attention.
I think in the African continent, I'm very optimistic because Africa has a very young population, which is increasingly aware, and this just provides an opportunity for citizen mobilization, increased political participation, and these young people on the continent, they yearn for reform, and they're like the main drivers of change. And reports do indicate that a lot of Africans continue to support democracy. They reject authoritarian regimes, and the young Facebook generation, so to speak, they want more accountable governments, and they insist on democracy and development simultaneously.
I think I'm also overwhelmingly optimistic when it comes to democracy in the future. So we have these different types of regimes that exist and that compete for like people's support. Authoritarian regimes on different types, democracy in different types, and all of these regimes will over the course of their life, or like in the journey going through time, encounter problems, economic crisis, and environmental crisis, wars on all of these problems, demographic crises. And democracies are able to decouple problems and solutions from people and parties. You can't just remove leaders or individuals. And authoritarian regimes are not capable of doing this. In authoritarian regimes, problems are associated with people. If you are the leader of North Korea and something goes south, there is no way of talking about that problem other than pointing the finger at you, similarly in China. And that then any crisis, any problem becomes like a system delegitimizing problem. And democracies are able to absorb these shocks. If you don't like what's happening, you literally have the chance of voting for a different political party. So any type of authoritarian structure, they're not allowed to do anything wrong, or they need to suppress with the military or force. And democracies don't need to do that, and that I think just gives them the edge in the long run.
So there you have it, unanimous optimism on the future of democracy. Good to So I've gone over time, so I apologize, but thank you again to Elise, Sam, and to Beth for putting the event together. And thank you. Maybe we'll give all the panelists a round of applause. Thank you.